Wallachia, Romania, December 1476. I'll never forget the day I saw the aftermath of Vlad the Impaler's final battle. A day so horrifying it seared into my soul. I stood on that blood-soaked field, the air thick with the stench of death, as Ottoman soldiers paraded his severed head, impaled on a spike. Vlad's lifeless eyes stared into the void, his mouth frozen in a silent scream, blood still dripping from the jagged cut at his neck. I watched, my heart pounding, as they laughed, their voices echoing over the battlefield, a cruel mockery of the man who'd once turned forests into graveyards of impaled bodies. This wasn't just a death, it was a desecration, a gruesome end for a ruler who'd struck terror into the hearts of empires. I was there, a trembling witness among the soldiers, as Vlad III the Impaler, the terror of Wallachia, met a fate as brutal as his own crimes. He'd tortured and killed tens of thousands, leaving their bodies to rot on wooden stakes. But now, he was the one impaled, his legacy drenched in blood. Was this divine justice for the monster he'd become, or a betrayal that sealed his doom, who orchestrated his downfall? And why did it have to be so savage I'm dragging you into this blood-soaked nightmare straight from Torture Vault, where we unearth the darkest horrors of history? Vlad's story is one of unimaginable cruelty, a reign of terror that shook the 15th century, recorded in chronicles like those of the Ottoman historian Tursun Beg. It's a tale so chilling, it inspired the legend of Dracula himself. Buckle up, because this story will make your skin crawl, and I promise, you won't forget the horrors I witnessed. Wallachia, Romania, 1448. I was a young scribe in the court of Wallachia when I first heard of Vlad III, the man who'd later be called the Impaler. It was a sweltering summer day, the air heavy with the scent of dust and fear. When he took the throne, a prince forged in blood and vengeance. I'd heard whispers of his past, stories that sent shivers down my spine even before I saw him. Vlad was born in 1431, the son of Vlad II Dracula, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a name that would later twist into the legend of Dracula. But I knew him as a boy who'd been scarred by cruelty. He'd been held hostage by the Ottoman Empire as a child, a pawn in their games of power. And that suffering turned him into a man who'd make empires tremble. I saw Wallachia through his eyes, a land torn apart by chaos. It was a small principality, caught between the mighty Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, a battleground where loyalty was bought with blood. I'd walk the streets of Targovishte, our capital, and hear the murmurs of war Ottoman armies pressing closer, Hungarian nobles scheming for control, and Wallachian boyars betraying their own for a taste of power. Vlad ruled in a time of constant threat, his throne a precarious seat in a world that wanted him dead. I watched him from the shadows of the court, his eyes burning with a fire that made even the bravest flinch, his voice a low growl as he vowed to protect his land at any cost. But I knew that cost would be paid in blood. Vlad wasn't just a ruler, he was a weapon, honed by years of captivity and betrayal. I heard the stories of his time with the Ottomans, how he'd learned their ways, their tactics, their cruelty, and turned them against his enemies. I read later, in the chronicles of German pamphlets printed in Nuremberg, how his reputation for savagery spread across Europe, earning him the name Tepes, the Impaler. They called him a monster, a devil in human form. but I saw a man shaped by a world that showed him no mercy. I knew he'd stop at nothing to keep Wallachia free, even if it meant turning his land into a nightmare of blood and screams. I could feel the darkness growing, and I wasn't prepared for the horrors I'd witness under his rule. Târgoviște, Wallachia, 1460. I'll never forget the day I walked through what they called the Forest of the Impaled, a sight so horrifying it turned my stomach inside out. I was in Târgoviște, Vlad's capital, when I saw his most brutal display of power, a field stretching for miles, filled with thousands of wooden stakes, each one piercing a writhing body. I stood there, my legs trembling, as I counted the victims: Ottoman soldiers, Wallachian traders, even innocent villagers impaled through their torsos, their screams echoing like a chorus of the damned. Blood dripped from the stakes, pooling on the ground, the stench of death so thick I could taste it on my tongue. Flies buzzed around the rotting flesh, and the air was filled with the groans of those still clinging to life. Their agony stretched out for hours, sometimes days, before death finally took them. I watched Vlad ride through that forest on horseback, his face cold, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. He'd ordered this massacre 20,000 souls. They said to send a message to the Ottoman Empire: cross me, and this will be your fate. I heard the stories of how he'd sit among the impaled, dining on bread and wine while their blood stained the ground, as if their suffering was a feast for his soul. Ottoman chroniclers like Leonikos Chalko-Kondyles later wrote of this forest of the impaled, a gruesome display that made even the Sultan's army turn back in fear. I couldn't look away. The horror was too real, the screams too loud, the smell too overwhelming. I'd never seen cruelty like this, a cruelty that turned a man into a myth, a monster whose name would echo through the ages. But Vlad's savagery wasn't just for his enemies. I saw him turn it on his own people. I was in the palace one spring when he invited Wallachian boyars to a feast, their laughter filling the hall as they drank to his health. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, a tension that made my skin crawl. Then, in an instant, Vlad's soldiers burst in, their swords drawn, and I watched as they slaughtered every noble at the table, their blood soaking the wooden floor. I heard Vlad's voice, calm and cold, ordering their bodies to be impaled outside the city gates, a warning to anyone who dared defy him. I later learned he'd killed hundreds of boyars, suspecting them of treason, their screams a constant reminder of his unyielding grip on power. I saw how Vlad ruled through fear, his every decree a death sentence for those who crossed him. I heard whispers of other horrors, how he'd burn entire villages to root out spies, boil thieves alive in cauldrons, or impale women and children to break the spirit of his enemies. I knew Vlad was a man possessed, his thirst for blood unquenchable, his heart hardened by years of betrayal. I thought he was untouchable, a monster who'd rule forever through terror. But even monsters meet their end, and his would be as brutal as his reign. Wallachia, Romania, 1462. I was among the soldiers who followed Vlad into battle against the Ottoman Empire, my hands gripping a quill even as I stood on the edge of war. It was a scorching summer, the air thick with dust and the stench of fear, as Vlad led us in a campaign to drive the Turks from our land. I'd seen his hatred for the Ottomans burn hotter than the sun above. He'd been their prisoner as a child, forced to bow to their sultans, and now he'd make them pay. I watched him lead night raids that left thousands of Ottoman soldiers dead, their bodies impaled along the banks of the Danube River. A gruesome message to Sultan Mehmed II. I can still hear the screams of those raids, the clash of steel, the wet thud of bodies hitting the ground, and Vlad's voice, a growl of defiance as he ordered more stakes to be driven into the earth. I saw his most daring act that year, the night attack at Targovishte. I was there, hidden in the shadows of the camp, as Vlad and his men struck the Ottoman army under cover of darkness. I heard the chaos erupt, tents burning, soldiers screaming, and the sound of Vlad's cavalry charging through the camp, their swords slashing through flesh. I watched as he killed thousands in a single night, their blood soaking the earth, a desperate attempt to assassinate the Sultan himself. Ottoman records later claimed he slaughtered over 15,000 men, a number I can't forget, their bodies left to rot as a warning. I saw the aftermath of his forest of the Impaled, a stretch of stakes that went on for miles, each one holding a writhing victim, their agony a testament to Vlad's unyielding wrath. Even the Sultan's army, hardened by years of war, turned back in fear. I heard they called him a demon, a beast no mortal could defeat. But I knew Vlad's luck wouldn't last. By 1476, I saw the tide turn against him. I was near Bucharest when his own allies betrayed him, their loyalty bought by Ottoman gold. I'd heard whispers of his brother Radu, a puppet of the Turks, working to undermine him. But I never thought it would come to this. I watched from a hill as Vlad fought his final battle, his army outnumbered, his men turning on him in the heat of the fight. I heard the clash of swords, the screams of the dying, and then silence. I knew he was gone, but I wasn't prepared for the horror that followed. I saw Ottoman soldiers dragging his body through the mud, their laughter echoing as they raised their swords to finish the job. Vlad's reign of terror had ended, but his death would be a nightmare as gruesome as the ones he'd inflicted, a fitting end for a man who'd lived by the sword. Bucharest, Romania, December 1476. I'll never forget the day I saw Vlad, the Impaler's severed head, impaled on a spike just outside the battlefield, a sight that still wakes me in a cold sweat. I stood there, my legs trembling, as Ottoman soldiers paraded his head through the ranks, their cheers a cruel mockery of the man who'd once been their greatest fear. His lifeless eyes stared into the void, his mouth frozen in a scream, blood still dripping from the jagged cut at his neck, pooling on the frozen ground below. I watched, my stomach churning, as flies buzzed around the rotting flesh, the stench of death so thick I could taste it on my tongue. I heard them laugh, their voices echoing over the battlefield, as they boasted of sending his head to Constantinople, a trophy for Sultan Mehmed II to display in his court. I saw what they did to the rest of him, or what was left. I was there when they dragged his body from the battlefield, his armor torn, his chest slashed open by Ottoman blades. I watched, my heart pounding, as they hacked at him like butchers, their swords slicing through flesh and bone until he was unrecognizable. Blood flowed like a river, staining the snow red, and I heard whispers that they'd torn him apart, leaving his remains for the wolves to devour. Some said his body was buried in an unmarked grave at Snagov Monastery, a secluded place just a few miles from the battlefield, but I never saw it. I heard others claim the Ottomans scattered his bones, ensuring the Impaler would never rest in peace. Byzantine historian Dukas later wrote that Vlad's head was preserved in honey and sent to the Sultan. a grim proof of his death. But the fate of his body remains a mystery to this day. I can still see that spike, that head, those empty eyes, a nightmare I'll never unsee. I knew Vlad's death was as brutal as his life. I'd seen him impale thousands, their screams filling the air as he watched with a cold smile. But now, he was the one impaled, his head a trophy for his enemies. I felt a twisted sense of justice. The man who'd lived by blood had died by it, his legacy as gruesome as his deeds. I heard the Ottomans call it a victory, but I saw it as a warning, a monster brought down by the very savagery he'd unleashed. I knew his name would live on, a curse whispered in fear, a legend that would haunt the ages. But I couldn't shake the horror of that day, the day Vlad the Impaler met his gruesome end. Snagov, Romania, 1477. I visited the supposed grave of Vlad the Impaler a year after his death, a quiet monastery surrounded by whispers of his ghost. I stood by the lake, the air cold and still, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. Snagov Monastery was said to hold his body, but I saw no marker, no proof, just rumors and shadows. I learned later that archaeological digs in the 20th century found no trace of Vlad's remains, fueling legends that he still walks the earth, a restless spirit born of blood. I've carried his story with me all these years, a scar on my soul I can't erase. Vlad's legacy lived on, his name a curse that echoed through the centuries, a symbol of terror that inspired the legend of Dracula. I saw his cruelty firsthand, the forests of the impaled, the screams of the innocent, the blood that stained Wallachia under his rule. But I also saw a man shaped by a world that showed him no mercy, a ruler who used terror to protect his land from invaders. I read how his story was retold in Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, turning him into a vampire, a myth that captured the world's imagination. But I knew the real Vlad, a man, not a monster, whose savagery was both his sword and his downfall. I learned a brutal lesson from his fall. Power built on fear can't last. It turns on you, devours you. Just as Vlad's enemies devoured him, his story is a warning, etched in blood, that even the mightiest can't escape the consequences of their sins. What do you think of Vlad's fate? Was he a hero defending his land? A monster who deserved his gruesome end? Or something in between? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below, and let's dig deeper into this bloody tale. I hope Vlad's story left you trembling. I know it still haunts me, even after all these years, if you're as gripped by these dark corners of history as I am. Torture Vault has more nightmares waiting for you. Check out the gruesome fall of Jezebel, devoured by dogs in a biblical horror, or the chilling tale of Sister Agnes, walled alive for a sin she didn't commit. They're in our playlist, ready to send chills down your spine. Don't miss what's coming next. I'm diving into the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, where the screams are as loud as Vlad's victims. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell so you don't miss a single descent into terror, and give this video a like if it made your skin crawl. I want to know what shocked you most about Vlad the Impaler's brutal fate. Was it his forest of the impaled, or the gruesome mystery of his death? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment. Thanks for joining me on this bloody journey. I'll see you in the next dark corner of history. Until then, stay safe and don't cross paths with a monster like Vlad.